The quiet streets of Ouagadougou are not usually the stage for military parades. But in August 2025, the silence of this West African capital was shattered by a thunder few had ever imagined. Engines roared, metal tracks ground against the pavement, and rows upon rows of Chinese-made armored vehicles, rocket launchers, and self-propelled artillery rolled into military bases under heavy guard. For ordinary Burkina citizens, it was a surreal sight. Their country, once mocked as a forgotten outpost of Western dependency, was now openly displaying an arsenal that rivaled some of Africa's strongest armies. This was not a rumor whispered in cafes or a speculative headline buried in the back of a newspaper. It was real. Verified video footage confirmed what many had only dared to imagine. Burkina Faso had turned east. Gone were the days of relying on leftover French vehicles and cautious U.S. support. In their place, gleaming convoys of VN-22B fire support vehicles and SR-5 rocket launchers painted in desert camouflage. For the first time in decades, the battlefield in the Sahel looked different, decisively different. But as the dust settled, a larger question emerged. Was this the dawn of true sovereignty for Burkina Faso, or merely the start of a new dependency under Beijing's shadow? Can weapons alone deliver peace in a land scarred by insurgency, or will they only shift the balance of power without addressing the wounds of its people? And most importantly, what does this transformation mean for Africa's future and for the global order that once took its dominance for granted? For those watching from across the Atlantic, especially Americans who remember the Cold War chessboard, the echoes are unmistakable. Another great power is planting its flag not with speeches, but with steel. And Africa, long treated as a pawn, is daring to move as a player in its own right. So let me ask you, do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's pivot to China represents real independence, or is Burkina Faso simply trading one master for another? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that telling the truth about Africa matters more than recycled headlines, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. When the sun rose over Ouagadougou in early August 2025, few citizens could have predicted the spectacle that would unfold before their eyes. By midday, the city's quiet avenues became the corridor for something that looked more like a military exhibition than a simple delivery. Convoys stretched as far as the eye could see, guarded by soldiers whose faces betrayed both pride and disbelief. The cargo was not humanitarian aid, not the usual second-hand jeeps from old allies in Paris or Washington. It was an arsenal fresh from the factories of Beijing. Witnesses stood along the roads as six-wheeled armored vehicles rumbled by their desert camouflage, glinting under the Sahel sun. Behind them came artillery pieces mounted on armored chassis capable of firing mortars and direct cannon rounds. And towering above the rest were the multiple rocket launchers, their modular pods a visible reminder that Burkina Faso now possessed something it had never had before: long-range precision strike capability. To see these weapons lined up openly at military bases was to witness a turning point in the nation's history. This was no longer the Burkina Faso of battered pickup trucks and outdated rifles. It was the Burkina Faso of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's vision, a military stepping into a new era. The centerpiece of this delivery was the VN-22B fire support vehicle. Compact yet deadly, this six-wheeled beast was engineered to withstand armor-piercing rounds while firing a stabilized 30mm autocannon. Unlike the improvised convoys of the past, these vehicles could fire accurately on the move, picking off ambushes before they could overwhelm a column. For soldiers long accustomed to being easy prey, this technology symbolized survival. Alongside them stood the PLS-05 hybrid gun mortars, a marvel of battlefield flexibility. One moment they could shell distant hideouts, and the next they could engage militants in direct combat without exposing crews or switching platforms. For a war where insurgents vanish into forests and villages, such adaptability was a dream come true. And perhaps most striking of all were the SR-5 multiple rocket launch systems, weapons that could rain guided or unguided fire up to 70 kilometers away. For insurgents who had once found safety in remote sanctuaries, those sanctuaries had suddenly become targets. This was not the first Chinese delivery. Over the past year, smaller shipments had quietly trickled in: mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, armored personnel carriers, heavy logistics trucks. But this August 2025 package was different, bigger, louder, and deliberately visible. It was rolled in not under secrecy, but under the eyes of cameras. This was meant to be seen both by the Burkina people and by the world. Traoré's government was sending a message: we are no longer begging for scraps, we are choosing our partners, and we are equipping ourselves for survival. The timing was no coincidence. Western military aid had dwindled. France had already pulled its troops from the Sahel after years of failed promises. The United States reduced its footprint, offering words and intelligence, but little in the way of boots or equipment. For a government fighting daily insurgent attacks, speeches in Washington meant little when villages were being burned and convoys ambushed. Into that vacuum stepped China, not with rhetoric but with steel and speed. This delivery was also about morale. For years, Burkina Faso soldiers went to war with aging Kalashnikovs, a few armored carriers, and courage as their only shield. Many felt abandoned by allies who once promised partnership. The sight of modern vehicles lined up in formation changed that psychology overnight. Soldiers saw proof that their government was investing in them. Citizens saw proof that the state still had strength to protect them. For the first time in years, there was hope that the tide could turn. But beyond the battlefield, the symbolism ran deeper. This was the burial of the old order, a visible break with the colonial past. For decades, French uniforms, French trainers, and French equipment had defined Burkina Faso's security. Now, under the watchful eyes of its people, the nation had chosen to rearm with weapons that bore no Western signature. It was not just about bullets and rockets, it was about sovereignty. In those hours when Chinese convoys rolled through Ouagadougou, a chapter closed and another began. The battlefield of the Sahel would never look the same. And neither would Burkina Faso's place in the world. The arrival of the Chinese arsenal did not simply equip Burkina Faso, it electrified the nation. For weeks after the August 2025 delivery, conversations in Ouagadougou's cafes, market stalls, and even rural villages revolved around the same topic: the weapons that changed everything. For soldiers, the sight of VN-22Bs roaring across the training fields was almost surreal. For ordinary citizens, it felt like watching their small, war-torn country suddenly stand taller on the global stage. The climax of this moment came when the army staged its first public drill with the new systems. Broadcast live on state television, the demonstration showed convoys of VN-22Bs advancing under simulated ambush, their autocannons tearing through mock targets with rapid precision. Next, PLL's Aero 5 gun mortars shifted from long-range bombardment to close fire support in a seamless transition, stunning even veteran officers who had never witnessed such versatility. Finally, the SR-5 rocket systems unleashed a barrage that echoed across the plains, sending shockwaves through the air and leaving a trail of smoke columns visible for miles. For Burkina Faso citizens huddled around television screens, this was more than firepower, it was reassurance. After years of helplessness, they saw their country finally able to fight back. But the impact was not confined to Burkina Faso. The region reacted with equal intensity. In neighboring Mali, already leaning heavily on Russian Wagner contractors, officials praised Ouagadougou's boldness. Niger, still reeling from political upheaval, quietly inquired about similar partnerships with China. Across the Sahel, a new narrative began to form: the post-Western security order. For the first time in decades, the region was openly considering a future without Paris or Washington at the center. Western capitals, however, were shaken. In Paris, commentators on national television warned that France's loss of influence in the Sahel was no longer symbolic, it was strategic. The image of Chinese rocket systems rolling through a former French stronghold hit a nerve. In Washington, analysts at think tanks debated whether America's cautious approach had created the very vacuum Beijing was now filling. Some argued that Washington had been too hesitant, too focused on governance conditions rather than immediate survival needs. Others worried aloud that the United States was watching a rerun of the Cold War, this time on African soil, with China stepping into roles once reserved for the West. International media quickly amplified the story. Footage of Burkina Faso's new arsenal appeared on CNN, Al Jazeera, and Chinese state television. Each network spun the images differently. Western outlets emphasized the risks of dependency and the possibility of Chinese debt traps. Chinese broadcasters celebrated the partnership as an example of mutual respect and South-South solidarity. African networks, meanwhile, portrayed it as a proud moment of sovereignty, framing Captain Ibrahim Traoré as a leader who dared to break the mold. Inside Burkina Faso, the psychological effect was perhaps the most decisive. Soldiers who once felt they were being sent to die with outdated tools now trained with confidence. Their morale soared as commanders emphasized that they were no longer on the defensive, they were equipped to dictate the tempo of battle. In villages long terrorized by militants, people whispered that maybe, just maybe, the days of ambushes and burned homes were numbered. Parents sent their children to school with a renewed sense of safety. Even if the weapons had not yet changed the battlefield, they had already changed the national spirit. Yet not all reactions were celebratory. Critics within civil society cautioned that firepower alone could not end the insurgency. Humanitarian groups reminded the government that displaced populations still numbered in the millions. Rockets can kill militants, one activist said, but they cannot rebuild homes or restore trust. These warnings highlighted the risk that enthusiasm for new weapons might overshadow the deeper political and social reforms needed for lasting peace. Nevertheless, for Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government, the moment of climax was clear. Burkina Faso had made a statement it would not collapse quietly under insurgent pressure, nor would it beg indefinitely at Western doors. Instead, it had chosen to arm itself boldly, even defiantly, with the help of Beijing. And in doing so, it forced the world to pay attention. This was the turning point, the instant when Burkina Faso's war was no longer just about survival. It was about sovereignty, about rewriting alliances, and about reshaping the narrative of an entire continent. The delivery of Chinese weapons was not just a military affair, it rippled through Burkina Faso's society and politics like an earthquake. Overnight, the country found itself at the center of debates that reached from dusty village squares to parliament halls, from family dinner tables to the editorial pages of international newspapers. For ordinary citizens, the most immediate consequence was a shift in morale. Families who had lived in fear of militants raiding their villages now felt a flicker of hope. Mothers who once hesitated to send their children to school in vulnerable rural areas began to believe security might finally return. Young men who had lost faith in the army suddenly spoke of enlisting, inspired by the idea that they would no longer be sent to fight with broken rifles and obsolete trucks. In a society where despair had become normal, this psychological shift was nothing short of revolutionary. On the political stage, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government reaped a surge of legitimacy. For years, leaders in Ouagadougou had been accused of weakness, of bending to foreign powers, of failing to provide security. The images of brand-new armored vehicles parked proudly in military bases countered those criticisms in one stroke. Citizens saw concrete evidence that their government was acting decisively. In the fragile arena of transitional politics, where doubts about Traoré's long-term vision persisted, the weapons served as proof of leadership. "At least he is doing something" became a common refrain among Burkinabe, even those skeptical of his broader agenda. The political effects extended beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In neighboring Mali and Niger, where populations had also grown weary of French dominance and Western promises, the sight of Burkina Faso arming itself independently carried symbolic weight. It suggested a new model of African sovereignty, one not bound to Paris or Washington. This emboldened conversations across the Sahel about breaking old colonial ties and forging new alliances. For regional movements advocating Pan-African unity, the delivery was not just about security, but about dignity. Still, the civil implications were not without complexity. Humanitarian organizations worried that the focus on firepower would overshadow urgent civilian needs. Burkina Faso still had nearly 2 million displaced people. Camps overflowed, food insecurity was rampant, and healthcare systems were strained. Critics argued that investing in schools, housing, and reconciliation programs could do as much to defeat insurgency as tanks and rockets. "Guns can protect a village for a day," one NGO worker noted, "but trust and justice are what protect it for a generation." There was also the risk of political dependency. While China demanded no reforms or democratic conditions in exchange for weapons, the repayment mechanisms likely tied to gold exports and long-term contracts worried some economists. If future revenues were mortgaged to Beijing, would Burkina Faso truly be independent, or would it simply trade one master for another? Opposition voices raised this question in parliament, warning that short-term security gains might come at the cost of long-term sovereignty. Internationally, the delivery heightened tensions between supporters of Traoré's vision and his critics. Western diplomats expressed concern that Burkina Faso was aligning itself too closely with authoritarian powers, potentially undermining democratic transitions. Meanwhile, African commentators countered that democracy meant little if people were killed in their homes. To them, sovereignty and survival were the real priorities, and weapons were the currency of both. In the end, the civil and political consequences of the August 2025 delivery can be summed up in one word: awakening. It awakened pride among soldiers, hope among civilians, legitimacy for the government, and anxiety among foreign powers. Whether this awakening leads to lasting stability or new dependencies remains uncertain. But one fact is undeniable: Burkina Faso had changed, and its people knew it. From Washington to Paris, the images of Chinese rocket launchers rolling through Ouagadougou were received with unease. For decades, Western powers had assumed that the Sahel, though unstable, would remain under their security umbrella. France, in particular, viewed Burkina Faso as part of its pré-carré, a backyard bound by history, language, and military dependence. The August 2025 delivery shattered that illusion. In Paris, the reaction was one of humiliation. Commentators admitted openly that France's credibility in Africa was in tatters. Operation Barkhane, once sold as a pillar of regional stability, now looked like a failed experiment. The fact that Burkina soldiers were training on Chinese systems rather than French ones symbolized more than a military shift. It was the end of France's role as security guarantor in the Sahel. Newspapers compared it to the loss of Algeria in the 1960s, another moment when Paris was forced to accept that history had moved on without it. In Washington, the response was more cautious, but equally concerned. U.S. defense analysts saw echoes of the Cold War, another great power, this time China, filling a vacuum America had left. For years, Washington had emphasized governance reforms, oversight, and counterterrorism frameworks when providing aid. But to Burkina leaders under daily attack, those conditions looked like delays. Now, watching Beijing deliver convoys of steel in a matter of months, many in Washington wondered aloud whether America's cautiousness had cost it influence. The Pentagon debated whether to expand drone bases and intelligence sharing, while the State Department worried that heavy-handed re-engagement might push Ouagadougou further eastward. In Beijing, the narrative was triumphant. State media framed the delivery as an example of South-South solidarity and pragmatic cooperation. By avoiding lectures on democracy or governance, China positioned itself as the partner Africa could rely on. More importantly, each vehicle delivered bound Burkina Faso's army to Chinese supply chains, ensuring long-term dependency on Beijing for parts, training, and upgrades. For China, the deal was not just about weapons, it was about planting roots in Africa's security architecture. Elsewhere in the world, reactions were mixed. Moscow welcomed the move, seeing it as complementary to Russia's growing role in Mali. Ankara noted with interest, as Turkey itself had been supplying drones to Niger. Across Africa, governments debated whether the Burkina Faso model could be replicated: swift, visible, unconditional military support from non-Western powers as an alternative to endless Western bureaucracy. But the deepest reaction may have come from the insurgent groups themselves. For years, their confidence rested on the belief that state forces were weak and ill-equipped. Now, with long-range rockets and mobile firepower in Burkina hands, that psychological advantage was broken. Militants adapted, quickly dispersing into smaller groups and embedding deeper within civilian populations, but the fear that once lived in the villages now began to shift toward the insurgents. Globally, one conclusion emerged: the Sahel was no longer a stage for Western experiments. It had become a front line of multipolar competition. Burkina Faso's pivot to China was not an isolated choice. It was a signal that Africa itself was redrawing the rules. The roar of Chinese engines in Ouagadougou was more than a parade of steel. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso, a nation once dismissed as powerless, had chosen to rewrite its destiny. Yet behind the spectacle lies a question that no convoy can answer: will these weapons bring lasting peace, or will they lock the country into a new cycle of dependency? For the Burkina soldier on the front lines, the answer feels immediate. Advanced firepower means survival today, the chance to repel ambushes and the hope of returning home alive. For the grieving mother in a displaced persons camp, however, peace will only be real when her children can sleep without fear, when her village is rebuilt, and when trust between citizens and state is restored. Rockets can kill insurgents, but they cannot heal wounds or rebuild homes. The world, too, is watching. In Paris and Washington, there is unease. In Beijing, quiet celebration. But the real significance lies not in foreign capitals, but in Africa itself. The Sahel is no longer a playground for external powers. It is a battlefield where sovereignty is tested, redefined, and claimed. And President Ibrahim Traoré has placed Burkina Faso at the center of that transformation. So I ask you, do you believe this pivot toward China marks the birth of true independence for Burkina Faso, or is it the beginning of another era of hidden dependency? Can Africa chart its own course, free from old masters and new patrons alike? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Share this video if you want to be among the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision. And subscribe if you believe the truth about Africa's future matters more than headlines written elsewhere.